Matt Chat, episode 171, featuring the second part of my interview with Mr. Josh Sawyer. Now, in this part of the interview, we focus in on Josh's early days in the industry, his work on the Icewind Dale and Neverwinter Nights series, as well as some projects that got canceled, such as Project Jefferson and the Aliens RPG. A lot of great stuff, so without further ado, here is Mr. Josh Sawyer. All right, Josh, you said in some other interviews that the games that have inspired you the most or had the most influence on you are Darklands, Fallout, and Pool of Radiance. And I assume this is the good Pool of Radiance. Right. So what was it about these games that sucked you in?
Well, Pool of Radiance, I like the ability to have my full party. I could make a party of all sorts of different characters. I liked the sense of exploration in Flan. I thought that was actually it's sort of crazy when you look at the map from the Adventurer's Journal, because it's like, here's the slums and Kudo's Well and Mendor's Library and all that stuff. But it was cool to be able to go into an area and kind of figure out where I could go. And so when you stumble into Mendor's Library and suddenly you're fighting a basilisk or a specter, you just came out of the slums. That was that was a big deal. And so that sense of exploration was really cool. I liked that it had a very Forgotten Realms feel, in the sense that a library has a basilisk and a specter in it. Like there are these really weird locations on the Sorcerer's Pyramid was another really just interesting weird location. It just had a lot of neat stuff in it, and so I liked that about Pool of Radiance. And the big battles, the big tactical battles, I thought were really fun. Sokol Keep was really cool. Belhingen Graveyard was really crazy, And then Darklands, great exploration. I really love history, so I love the idea of having a historically based game that tried to be extremely accurate and down to earth with everything. And I think that if that was an afterthought, I wouldn't like it nearly as much. But the fact that it is so consistent in how it approaches the historical content really made me love it. It was the first real-time with pause combat system that I can remember, so I really enjoyed that. And I thought they had an interesting approach to magic. The way that they use Saints and Alchemy was really awesome. And then Fallout. Fallout was really, to me, the first game I had played where I felt like choice and consequence, in the sense of being able to be the type of character personality-wise that I wanted to be, was really supported. So I could be a really horrible. I could kill everyone, or I could kill nobody. I could be very. I had a lot of agency, and so Fallout, I think, to me was the beginning of where I really started to think it's really cool in a game when it doesn't just allow you what sort of character to be from the perspective of mechanically what character do I want to be, but who do I want to be as a person, and the game responds to it. It's not just that I can make a choice and it gets thrown into the ether and it disappears. It's that I make a choice and people care about it. And some of those choices have short-term impacts, and other ones have long-term impacts. And the way that those choices sort of interleave makes it my story, not just the designer's story.
Well, Josh, let's talk about your origins in the industry. I saw a funny quotation from an earlier interview where you described yourself as a lazy wastrel. Back in the day, I guess in college, a lazy wastrel who plays video games and tabletop RPGs all day. But then I guess you had this epiphany and you taught yourself Flash and then sent your resume off to Interplay. That's one of the more interesting origin stories. Is that an accurate assessment?
I've been playing tabletop D&D since the early 80s, I guess. I started with the Red Box. And Bard's Tale was my first CRPG, which I can't remember which game. I think Bard's Tale actually came before the tabletop stuff, but Bard's Tale won in the Commodore 64, and then a lot of D&D. And then when I went into college, I played a lot of D&D in high school and a few other role-playing games, but in college I really played a ton of tabletop games, and I continued playing video games. And I really was not a good student. I originally went to school for music, and then I switched over to the college and became a history student. And actually, I wound up studying the history of witch hunting in the Holy Roman Empire, so there's a lot of Darklands overlap there. And I taught myself web design. I don't know what it was. I'd always been interested in graphic design, I guess. And so I taught myself web design. and eventually I taught myself Flash to do a tattooing website for a tattoo parlor. And then a friend of mine in college, he told me that Interplay was hiring a webmaster, and I was about to graduate, and honestly, I had a really bad, really bad grade point average, and I did not know what I was going to do with my history degree and theater minor. So not that that would have helped very
You
much.
could always fall back on the theater if the history
Yeah,
thing
yeah,
doesn't.
yeah. So, but I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. I figured I would just be a web developer in Wisconsin, but I saw this opportunity, and because I had played so much D&D, and I knew that Black Isle was sort of involved in D&D stuff, I sent this crazy. I think it was like a 3 or 4 page cover letter. It's ridiculous. Like I I'm glad I don't have it anymore because I think I'd probably be embarrassed if I read it. But I just went off like about everything I wanted to see in the future of role playing games and D&D games and stuff like that. And I got an interview and I flew out there and I was actually there were I was not the first choice. There was another choice who he was more qualified than me, and he was going to take the job. He was going to take the job, but then his girlfriend was moving to Oregon, so he decided to move with her. So wherever you are, guy, thank you. So I got hired there, and I was the web designer for Planescape Torment, and then eventually I redesigned the Baldur's Gate site. I designed the Icewind Dale site, and then the original Neverwinter Nights site. But then after that, I transferred over into development full time as a junior designer on Icewind Dale.
Yeah, I was wondering about that transition. It sounds like you were having a lot of fun doing the websites, but I guess you also had a lot of regular interaction with the rest of the team, right?
Yeah, I was over. We were in 2 buildings in Interplay there, and so I was with the web team in the building that the executive row was in, and Black Isle was over in the more development centric building. So I would run across the street, run upstairs, and go and talk to Tim Donnelly from the Torment team, or Avalon, or Colin McComb, or whomever, and I would just kind of ask them questions and kind of harass them and bother them, and I would bother Fergus. And I think at a certain point, a few of them sort of realized that I knew a lot about D&D, and like really a lot about D&D, and they wanted to make a Forgotten Realms game, and I knew a ton about the Forgotten Realms. So there was just an opening for a junior design position. And it started out first time, but I didn't really know what I was doing in terms of the editor side of things, or even in some ways common sense. A lot of times escaped me, but but I put a lot of time and effort into it, and I eventually got to a place where I was like, okay, I kind of know what I'm doing now, and then I switched over full time.
Was your first project something called Project Jefferson, which apparently was going to be a third Baldur's Gate game? I mean, what I wouldn't give to see that. I mean, what can you tell me about that project?
Well, so that actually wasn't my first project. My first project
Oh,
was
okay.
original Icewind Dale. So I worked on Icewind Dale, and then I worked on Heart of Winter, which is the expansion. And around that time, I had talked to Fergus about. I had said we should do we should do a Forgotten Realms game using our own technology, and we should try to make it 3D, but we should use pre-rendered shadows and light maps so that it really has like the cool lighting, because this was really still pretty early in 3D. And so when we looked at Neverwinter Nights had a ton of modularity. You could swap pieces out in real time and do all this awesome stuff, but it was all dynamic lighting, and at that time, dynamic lighting was not great. So I said, why don't we make our own tech? We can make this awesome editor. We can make all this stuff, and that way we don't have to be reliant on someone else's technology. And yeah, it was actually not initially conceived of as being a Baldur's Gate title. It was a title that was set in the Dale Lands part of the Forgotten Realms, and it was a third edition game. And what eventually happened, though, is that due to various legal complications, Interplay lost the right to. Basically, they only retained the right to make, as far as I know, Icewind Dale games, Baldur's Gate games, and maybe Dark Alliance games. So because of that, it was like, well, is this game we're making closer to Baldur's Gate or Icewind Dale? And we're like, well, I mean, I guess it's closer to Baldur's Gate. So then it became labeled as Baldur's Gate 3, but it really didn't have anything to do with the plot line of the first 2 games.
So what did you do on Icewind Dale 1?
What I did on Icewind Dale 1 was primarily area design and a lot of item and spell design. So I worked on Dragon's Eye, That was probably my first area, which probably shows because it's not that good. I worked on Dragon's Eye. I worked on Lower Dorn's Deep. I worked on, I think, a few levels of Cresselak's Tomb with John Diley. I helped work with Steve Bacchus on the final battle with Belifet. And I wrote a variety of characters, nothing really major. And then a lot of the rest of the stuff that I did was new rule system stuff. So I helped design and implement the racial abilities because those actually weren't in Baldur's Gate. Those came with Icewind Dale. So we implemented all the racial abilities for characters, all the new spells. We expanded the Druid spell selection stuff for Heart of Winter later on. And I wrote, I think, about 80 descriptions for unique items in Icewind Dale. That was something that I really enjoyed doing. I was really a fan of the old Forgotten Realm supplements like the Magister, where you open them up and they have stats for weapons, but like the stats for the weapons are kind of like, yeah, that's at the end. The beginning of it is the cool story about, where this weapon came from and what adventurers used it and how they died, and then this other guy took it and it got lost. So I had a lot of fun writing that stuff up, and but yeah, it was a mixture of stuff. I mostly did area design, item design, and spell design.
Well, is it true that Icewind Dale 2 was your first project as a lead?
Well, technically, Jefferson was my first project as a lead, but Icewind was the first project that I had where it shipped and I was the lead.
Okay, well, anyway, Icewind Dale 2, one of my favorite games. And I'm curious about the development of this game as well as just in general your thoughts on the party-based games versus a single-character game.
So Icewind Dale 2 was kind of an emergency for us. It basically Torn was canceled. Torn was a project that Black Isle had been working on for a while, and Interplay, for a variety of reasons, was not in great shape, and Torn had some problems, unfortunately, because there was a lot of cool stuff in it. But it was canceled, and so we had a lot of people in the studio. And it was also the first time, I think, ever that anyone in Black Isle had been laid off. We had had no layoffs prior to Torn being canceled. And even though it was only 4 or 5 people, it was 4 or 5 people that a lot of us have been working with for a long time. So we kind of went into an emergency mode where we needed to make a solid game in a reasonable amount of time that we knew we could get done without a lot of complications. The original timeline for Icewind Dale 2 was actually only 4 months. It was this timeline to make it was about 4 months, and I think I had like 2 days to write the story for it. So write the story, lay out the major characters, and what all the areas would be. I didn't have to fully design the areas, but I had to block out, like, we're going to have an ice temple, we're going to have this, we're going to have this forest area, we're going to have the Black Raven Monastery, we're going to have this, and I gave a very high level overview of what those things were going to be. But then it was like a sprint. Like, we had all these designers who had a ton of experience working on Torment and Icewind Dale 1 and Heart of Winter and Trials of Lure Master. And I was just like, guys, here is a high-level design. You know how to make these games. Go. And it was a struggle, and area design can't be compressed that much. Even with the number of designers we had on that team, we couldn't compress area design enough to get it out in 4 months. And we were pretty aware of that, but that's what was kind of desired. So we pushed for it. When it became obvious that there was no way that we were going to do that, we sort of reevaluated what we were doing. We decided it made sense to make it a 3rd edition game as much as we could. And the major things that we left out were things like metamagic feats and attacks of opportunity. There were a few other things that were oversights, but we actually converted a surprising amount of the engine over to 3rd edition rules and added in a lot of the optional Forgotten Realms sub-races and things like that. And in total, it was a 10-month development cycle. And it was a really big game. Fergus, I know, was very concerned that it was going to be too short because Heart of Winter wound up being very short. But that was not a short game. It probably would have benefited from being a little bit shorter. There's a lot of content in there that was really extremely dense with combat, or wasn't very polished. So I think a lot of us regret that we didn't have time to kind of like polish that stuff up. But it was done in 10 months, and I think people had a pretty good amount of fun with it. So it was a nice send off for the Infinity Engine.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. A very fun game. I'm surprised, I didn't realize it had this sort of turgid development history. But what about Gauntlet 7 Sorrows? as my understanding, you worked on that for a while with John Romero. He's one of my earlier interviews. Midway's San Diego studio. Now, something didn't work out with this project. I mean, what was going on?
I think I'll just say it didn't work out. My idea of the level of what needed to be done with that game didn't really match what Midway wanted to do with it. And I understood that they needed to do what they needed to do, but I said, I don't want to be here to do that. So I left.
I get the feeling they'd have been better off going with your view.
Well, it's hard. It's one of those things where I like being a designer because I don't have to deal with. I don't really want to run a company, and the more I sort of see, either at a very high level, like at a company the size of Midway, or even like the stuff that the owners at Obsidian have to deal with. Like, I'm sure that there's a certain satisfaction that comes with running a company very well, but I am fine with the pressure of running a team. And so again, when I sort of looked at Midway, like what they were doing to a certain extent made financial sense. But I said, well, but I'm a designer and I want to design things. I don't want to just make things for the sake of making them or make things for the sake of making money. So I said, it's fine that you want to do that and make this game, but I don't want to do it that way. And so I decided to leave. So.
Well, after Black Isle Studios was shut down, you moved to Obsidian Entertainment, right? So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about this transition.
It was Black Isle to Midway and then to Obsidian.
Okay, so after Black Isle shut down, you went to Midway, which we just talked about, and then to Obsidian. So can you tell me a little bit about what Obsidian was like at this time?
It was interesting because they had already done Knights of the Old Republic 2, and that was a big crunch for those guys. And they had launched right into making Neverwinter Nights 2. And there was a pretty big team there. I mean, I think maybe I had come up once before and seen the team when it was very small when it was initially working on KOTOR 2, and it was way bigger when they were working on Neverwinter 2. But it was kind of frantic, and there were a lot of questions. I mean, they were redoing the renderer, and there was still a lot of development going on of core content. But it was a lot of people that I'd seen at Black Isle, so I knew all those guys. And then there were a number of other people from even earlier at Interplay, like T-Ray, Trammell, Isaac, had also come there, and so it was a pretty interesting group of guys that were working there at the time.
So what was the first project you worked on at Obsidian?
I worked on Neverwinter 2 initially. For a while, when I was on the project, I wasn't sure if I was necessarily a great fit for the team. And so I worked on another project for a while that eventually was canceled. And then eventually I came back over to Neverwinter 2 after Ferret, who was the lead designer, had left Neverwinter 2. I went back over to Neverwinter 2 for the last 6 months to sort of wrap it up. So most of my responsibilities in Neverwinter 2 were not so much content creation, although I did a little bit of that, but it was mostly very high level design stuff, like sort of determining how do we revise this to make this work, what features do we really want to get in, how should this design really be approached. So it was a lot of kind of troubleshooting and firefighting and doing a triage on what was there.
That project that got canceled, was that the Aliens RPG?
Well, that was another project that got canceled even later.
Oh, okay. I got my cancellations mixed up here. Yep. So what was the one that got canceled for Obsidian?
What's that?
What project got canceled from Obsidian?
I don't think we ever said what that was, or if we can actually say it anymore. So sorry.
Wow, that's extremely canceled. Yeah. What about the Aliens one then?
The Aliens project came later. That was working with Sega. I thought that was actually a really good fit. A lot of people didn't understand why we would want to make or how we could make a role-playing game in the Aliens universe. I thought it was actually a great fit. I think that the Aliens films, even though people think of them as being about the aliens, I think they're actually more about the humans and the androids and how they interact and how they screw each other over or bond or, basically sacrifice to keep each other alive. And so it seemed like a great fit for the sort of role-playing game that Black Isle had made and that Obsidian had made. So that went on for a while, and Yeah, for various reasons that wound up being canceled. It was a lot of fun working on it, but yeah, that's what happened.
Yeah, I mean that one. I really wish that hadn't been canceled because it really sounds fascinating to me as well. You know, this I love the Aliens universe. But what about Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance?
Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance was something I don't actually know who came up with the idea for doing it, but I think the idea was Interplay wanted to do more console development because we had been a very strictly PC house for a long time, or maybe that's not really accurate, but a really heavy emphasis on PC stuff, and especially with role playing games, it was very much PC focused. Uh, in Black Isle, we sort of recognized that the games that we made were very focused on the PC and would probably not be such a great fit for the console. And with Snowblind, Black Isle published it. I think Avalon did a decent amount of work on it. I did a little bit of work on some of the. It wasn't a ton of work. It was like spell design, and some UI design. But really, it was just to say, you know, take the sort of spirit of kind of a single player D&D game and make it into something that's more console friendly. So it's not really deep, but it tries to capture the spirit of a lot of the things that you find in it, not even the mechanics, but like, if you play a barbarian or if you play this sort of a character, it kind of gives that feel of being that sort of a character in a D&D game, not mechanically, but just sort of the idea of being that character. And it was really more, more of kind of a hack and slash and loot game. In Dark Alliance 2, I actually thought that the team did a really great job. Dave Maldonado and the other designers, I think they made a lot of awesome, actually like really interesting characters in those games and made a lot of cool mechanical additions. But they were pretty neat because that was my first real exposure to console gaming at all. It wasn't until Midway that I actually was fully involved in console development. So Dark Alliance was a cool introduction.
That's all for this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I should be back next week with part 3 of my interview with Mr. Josh Sawyer. A lot of great stuff coming up, including his time at Obsidian and his work on the Fallout games. A lot of great stuff coming up, so stay tuned for that. Also, the Kickstarter projects I talked about last time, Hero U and the Shadowgate game, those projects are about halfway done now, and they still got a long ways to go on there before they'll make their goals. So I'm going to post in the show notes links to that, also a link to Sandy Peterson's Call of Cthulhu game for you. So if you want to support those projects, the time to do it is now. I'd really hate to see any of those projects not make their goals. So please, if you like Sandy and Lori and Corey and Dave, go support their Kickstarter projects. I'm sure they'll really appreciate that, and it'll help us get some really cool new games. Now, also, don't forget to support this show. If you want to see more interviews with your favorite designers and retrospectives of your favorite computer games, then go to armchairarcade.com, look for the Matt Chat link in the top right corner. Donations of any size are appreciated, and they're very much needed and necessary to keep these episodes coming. So thank you very much, guys. Now, what about that ale of the week? This week I have a little selection here called the Chain Breaker White IPA. This is brewed by the Deschutes Brewery in Bend, Oregon. Pretty interesting slogan they've got here. The trail to tasty is never safe and gentle, but where's the fun in middle of the road? Sentiment I hardly agree with. Not seeing a lot of information here on the bottle. Apparently they want me to pour 2/3 in a tilted glass, swirl what's left around the bottle, resume pouring. Yeah, I think I'll just use my trusty drinking horn. I do not see... Oh, there it is, 5.6% alcohol, so that shouldn't be bad at all. So let's get this open and see what it's all about. Alright, so I got some of this Chain Breaker here in the old drinking horn. Smells good, kind of a citrusy lemon, almost a bit of orange scent in there. Really nice, really fragrant. My hopes are up for this. Let's give it a taste. Quite pleasant, a little bitterness, a little hoppiness. I guess that's the IPA part of that. That's followed by that a very citrusy aftertaste on this. It's not bad at all. Definitely some sophistication, I guess, with the flavors. You kind of get sort of a lemon pine kind of aftertaste in there. It's maybe a little on the bitter side if you don't like bitterness and hoppiness, but I actually quite like this one. You know, it's kind of tough to make a really good call on this one, but I think I'm going to go maybe with 3 out of 5 drinking horns on this. Quite nice. Probably not my favorite IPA ever, but it's interesting and definitely worth checking out. So, Chainbreaker White IPA. Now what about the quotation? The quotation from this week comes from one of my favorite philosophers of all time, Plato, and it goes something like this. You can learn more about a man in an hour of play than a whole year of conversation. See you guys next week.
How could anything grow in that place? It smells of death.
Death and power are close cousins.
Don't think I like your relatives, old man.